the Cheyenne left nothing but fire, silence, and bodies. For a frontier scout arriving at the scene, rescue wasn't just unlikely, it was mathematically impossible. The massacre at Twin Mounds was designed to be an ending, a full stop written in blood on the Kansas prairie. But sometimes, the only thing that answers a prayer is a miracle so strange, the battle-hardened U.S. cavalry wouldn't believe their own eyes. This story isn't about the tragedy everyone expected. It's about the rescue nobody could possibly explain. Before the blood, there was the land. And in central Kansas, the land was a beautiful lie. The focal point of this deception was two hills, the Twin Mounds, rising like matching shoulders from the earth. They were landmarks, visible for 30 miles, each scarred with an identical patch of white limestone, as if marked by the same branding iron. Beneath them ran the ghosts of old trails, the path of the Mormon Exodus and the route of General John C. Fremont's 1843 expedition. This place had history, written in wagon ruts and shallow graves. In the valley, by the Elkhorn River, a great oak once stood where Fremont reportedly had a mutineer shot, a grim monument to the unforgiving nature of the frontier. The land was a paradox of lush life and sudden death, a place where the valleys were thick with timber, a haven for elk, bison, and the Cheyenne who hunted them. By 1866, however, the landscape was changing. The old abundance was fading, replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. The only constant was the mirage. On a hot, still day, the air itself would bend and warp reality. A man standing on one of the mounds could appear as a giant floating in mid-air, a shimmering phantom suspended between earth and sky. It was a local quirk, a trick of the light. But in a place so close to violence, it felt like a warning that what you were seeing could not be trusted. This optical illusion was merely a prelude to the much larger, more brutal deceptions to come. The establishment of Fort Harker that autumn was the official start of the trouble. It was a new stake driven into the heart of a territory that the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa tribes considered their sacred hunting ground. They did not send diplomatic letters to express their disapproval. They sent war parties. For them, the arrival of white settlers wasn't progress, it was an invasion, and they responded to it with the only language the frontier truly respected: violence. Any homesteader foolish enough to venture beyond the fort's protective shadow was not just taking a risk. They were volunteering for a starring role in their own disappearance, their story ending in a shallow grave or as a captive in a hostile camp. Into this powder keg walked a man who seemed determined to light the fuse. His name was Paul Raum, a widower who had moved his family from Wisconsin with a pioneer's stubborn optimism. The military advisors at Fort Harker told him explicitly not to settle near the Twin Mounds, that it was suicidal. Raum listened, nodded, and then proceeded to build his farm right there, at a picturesque spring dangerously far from any hope of rescue. He was a man of some refinement, and with him was his 18-year-old daughter, Susie. She was beautiful, with dark hair and a quiet, gentle demeanor. But her primary role was that of a surrogate mother to her 4 younger siblings. They were not the rough, desperate settlers of frontier lore. They were a graceful family who built a comfortable log home and lived a life of seeming contentment, surrounded by an abundance of wild game and a quiet that they mistook for peace. The other key player in this drama was everything Paul Raum was not. His name was Jack Hart. At 23, he was one of the government's top scouts at Fort Harker, a man who understood the prairie's lethal calculus perfectly. He was educated and well-spoken, but that civility was a thin veneer over a core of hardened steel. He was a dead shot with a rifle or a revolver, could read a trail like a newspaper, and possessed a preternatural ability for quick, decisive action in the face of danger. The officers at the fort adored him, trusting him with missions that required not just courage, but a cunning that bordered on clairvoyance. Jack Hart was the ultimate realist in a land of deadly illusions, a man paid to see the truth, no matter how ugly it was. Inevitably, the realist met the idealist's daughter. In April of 1867, Jack was guiding a company of the 5th Cavalry back to Fort Harker when they stopped at the Raum homestead. While the officers enjoyed a meal, Jack saw Susie for the first time. It's the old, common story of love at first sight, the kind of cliché that usually ends in a quiet wedding. But on the frontier, the universe has a much darker sense of humor, and this particular story was destined for a different kind of ceremony. From that day on, anytime Jack had a day's leave, he would saddle his horse, Tatanka, and ride the long miles to the Twin Mounds. The courtship was brutally efficient, just like everything else in that land. In less than a month, Susie Raum had promised to be his wife. One evening, sitting on the porch of the cabin her father had so foolishly built, they made their plans. There was no chaplain at Fort Harker yet, but one was expected from Fort Leavenworth in a few weeks. They would marry the moment he arrived. Jack had been saving his pay. He had enough to quit the scouting life, to buy his own tract of land, and build a home right there, near her family, so they wouldn't be separated. Her father agreed to the match, but as Jack prepared to leave, the scout in him took over. He looked the older man in the eye and gave him a solemn warning to remain vigilant, to never underestimate the ever-present threat of a Cheyenne raid. It was a warning that would echo with tragic irony in the weeks to come. Jack rode back to Fort Harker under the cover of darkness, his heart full of a future that seemed solid and real. He awoke the next morning ready to count the days until the chaplain arrived. But the frontier doesn't wait for chaplains, and it doesn't care about your plans. As he was saddling his horse, an orderly appeared with a summons from the commanding officer. With a sinking feeling, Jack reported to General Sully, who informed him that every other scout was out on assignment. He was the only one left, and he had to ride out immediately. A detachment of the 5th Cavalry was coming in from Fort Saunders, and Jack was ordered to guide them from the Saline River. It was more than just a guide mission. As a final blow, he was handed a packet of dispatches for the detachment's commander. He was being sent in the opposite direction of his future. As he rode away from the fort, he could see the twin mounds in the distance, a constant, silent reminder of the woman he was leaving behind. His new orders sent him deep into the territory of the Kiowa, who, under the leadership of the infamous chief Satanta, were busy raiding wagon trains along the Arkansas River. The mission was supposed to be a simple escort. Instead, it stretched on for weeks, a series of tense patrols and fleeting skirmishes, pulling Jack further and further away, while at the Twin Mounds, the time for warnings was running out. While Jack Hart was chasing Kiowa war parties across the plains, the situation back home was spiraling out of control. The Allied tribes, emboldened by the scattered and ineffective presence of the U.S. military, had escalated their campaign of resistance. The tipping point was the massacre at Spillman Creek. A raid of such calculated brutality, it sent shockwaves through the territory. It was the final straw for the government. From his headquarters, General Sheridan declared that the time for patrols was over. He was launching a full-scale winter campaign designed to crush the tribes once and for all. Every scout, every soldier, every asset was recalled to their post to prepare for the coming conflict. Among them was Jack Hart, finally released from his long mission, his mind focused on only one thing: the woman waiting for him at Twin Mounds. He arrived back at Fort Harker exhausted but hopeful. This was it. His scouting days were numbered, and his future was waiting just a few miles away. The very next morning, he prepared for the journey that would change his life. He shaved, put on a fresh set of clothes, and walked with a purpose toward the stables to saddle his horse, Tatanka. But the United States Army, then as now, had a knack for truly terrible timing. Just as he was tightening the cinch, an orderly ran up to him, breathless. The fort's commander, General Sully, wanted to see him. Immediately, Jack's heart sank. He knew what was coming. In the general's office, his fears were confirmed. With every other scout still out on long-range patrols, Jack was the only man available for a critical task. He was to ride out to the Saline River, locate a detachment of the 5th Cavalry, and guide them back to Fort Harker. It was a cruel twist of fate, a bureaucratic absurdity that felt like a personal insult. Jack, with his spirit crushed, took the dispatches and rode out, his back to the fort and his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the Twin Mounds, a promise he was once again being forced to break. He performed his duty with professional speed, reaching the Saline by mid-afternoon and locating the cavalry column. He delivered his dispatches, and the commander decided to make camp for the night. Responsibility is a heavy saddle, but desire is a powerful horse. After a quick meal, the pull of the Twin Mounds, only 15 miles to the southeast, became unbearable. Jack approached the commanding officer and requested permission for a short detour. He explained his fiancée lived at the Raum farm and that he could be there and back before the column was ready to move at sunrise. The colonel, in a moment of cheerful ignorance that would unknowingly save 2 lives, happily approved the request. Jack, grateful, knelt and drew a crude map in the sand with his finger, showing the officer the best route to Fort Harker. Then he mounted Tatanka and rode into the twilight, his heart soaring with the thought of the reunion to come. He arrived at the farm just as dusk was painting the prairie in shades of purple and gray. But the beautiful scene was spoiled by a smell on the wind, wood smoke. Not the comforting smoke of a hearth, but the acrid smell of green wood burning. As he cleared the last line of trees, the sight that greeted him turned his blood to ice. The cabin's roof was gone, torn away, and the logs were still smoldering. An awful, profound silence had fallen over the place. He knew instantly this was the work of the Cheyenne. Drawing his carbine, he urged his horse forward, praying a desperate, silent prayer. Near the ruins, he found them. The mutilated bodies of Paul Raum and his 4 small children, scattered like discarded dolls. Grief is a fire. It can consume you, or you can forge it into a weapon. He searched frantically for Susie, his dread growing with every step. Her body wasn't there. For a brief, insane moment, he felt a wave of relief, but it was immediately drowned by a far more terrifying thought: a captive. Taken by the warriors for a fate that many on the frontier considered infinitely worse than a quick death. A strangled cry of anguish escaped his lips. For a moment, he nearly broke. But Jack Hart was a survivor. He pushed the despair down, and in its place, a cold, diamond-hard resolve formed. He looked at the devastation and swore a quiet, deadly oath to himself. He would have his vengeance. 10 lives for everyone taken here. Numbed by a grief too profound for tears, Jack walked like a man in a trance toward the spring, needing to calm the fire in his throat. As he approached the dense thicket of brush that shielded the water, he heard it. A low, soft moan. His training snapped him back to reality in an instant. He froze, his senses on high alert, cocking the hammer on his carbine. The sound came again, a faint whisper of life in a place of death. He pushed through the brush and saw a figure lying face down on the ground, pale lips just touching the edge of the water. It was Susie. He rushed to her side, his heart breaking all over again, convinced he was too late. He knelt, gently stroked her hair, and leaned down to kiss her cold forehead in a final, sorrowful farewell. But as his lips touched her skin, her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, a flicker of recognition passed through them. That's when he saw the dark, ugly patch of dried blood on the grass beneath her. He asked where she was hurt, and she could only whisper, "Here," her hand weakly touching her side. There is no modesty at the edge of the grave. He told her he had to see the wound to save her, and she, too weak to resist, acquiesced. He carefully cut away the fabric of her dress with his dagger and found a vicious-looking spear wound just below her right shoulder. It had bled profusely, but by some miracle, the blade had missed her lung, and the bleeding had stopped. He was not a doctor, but he was a man who knew how to keep a body from dying. He gently cleaned the wound, bandaged it with a strip of her own dress, and carried her to a soft patch of grass, making a pillow from his saddle and covering her with his saddle blanket. He nursed her through that long, dark night. He brewed coffee, strong and black, and managed to get her to eat a few bites of hardtack from his saddlebags. The simple warmth and nourishment began to fight back the fever and shock, and she finally drifted into a fitful sleep. Jack sat vigil, a silent guardian, bathing her temples with cool water when she grew restless, his mind a whirlwind of grief, rage, and a fragile, terrifying hope. By morning, she was lucid. She looked at him with an expression of profound love and gratitude, knowing that without his impossible arrival, she would have died by that spring. The reality of their situation was grim. He was technically a deserter, she was gravely wounded, and they were miles from safety in the heart of Cheyenne territory. He made his decision. The army, his career, none of it mattered. He would sacrifice everything to save her. He told her they had to get to Fort Harker, and after she insisted she was strong enough to ride, he made a fateful choice. He would do a quick scout of the surrounding area on foot first, just to be sure no warriors were lingering nearby. He left his carbine and revolvers with her, knowing she could use them if needed. The prairie had more than one kind of predator. Jack had just emerged from the tree line onto the open grassland when he came face to face with a massive female cougar and her 3 cubs. Normally, the big cats avoided humans, but a mother protecting her young is one of the most aggressive forces in nature. With a low, guttural snarl, the cat launched itself at him before he could even draw his knife. It slammed into his chest, knocking him to the ground, its powerful claws digging deep into his shoulders. The fight was a chaotic, desperate blur of thrashing limbs, razor-sharp claws, and snapping teeth. Jack, pinned beneath the furious animal, fought with the primal instinct of a cornered man. He was being shredded, blood pouring from more than a dozen deep gashes on his shoulders, legs, and body. But he managed to protect his face and throat. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he drove his knife with all his strength into the cougar's side, searching for its heart. The beast shuddered and went limp. In their death struggle, they had rolled to the edge of a low, rocky ledge. As the cougar died, its dead weight carried them both over the side, tumbling to the flat prairie below. Jack Hart, having lost a massive amount of blood, hit the ground and sank into darkness. 15 miles away, the men of the 5th Cavalry were having a very boring morning. The sun was climbing, and the soldiers went about the mundane tasks of camp life, grooming their horses and waiting for the order to move. The commanding officer and his staff were idly scanning the horizon with their field glasses, admiring the vast, empty beauty of the Kansas prairie. It was a moment of profound peace, the kind that on the frontier so often comes just before everything goes to hell. Suddenly, the colonel stiffened, focusing his glasses intently on the distant twin mounds. "Look there, gentlemen," he called out, his voice sharp with surprise. A mirage. Every man in the camp turned to look. What they saw silenced them completely. It wasn't the usual shimmering distortion of the horizon. Hanging in the sky, framed by a hazy, purple mist, were two enormous figures. One was clearly a man, the other a great beast, and they were locked in what appeared to be a titanic struggle to the death. The atmospheric conditions had magnified them to a colossal size, making them look like gods battling in the heavens. The soldiers, men who lived with violence and superstition in equal measure, watched in stunned, fearful awe. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and utterly inexplicable vision. The colonel, his knuckles white on his field glasses, recognized the impossible. The human figure, impossibly large and fighting for its life in the sky, was their scout, Jack Hart. There was no mistaking him. The officers and men watched the phantom battle, mesmerized, until the two struggling forms seemed to fall from a great, invisible cliff and vanished from view. The mirage was gone. But the colonel knew he had not just witnessed a trick of the light. He had been shown a real event, broadcast across the miles by some bizarre quirk of nature. Without a moment's hesitation, he turned to his bugler. "Boots and saddles!" he roared. "Now! A man's life may depend on our speed!" In less than 15 minutes, the entire column was thundering across the prairie, racing toward the scene of the ghostly conflict. It was a hard 4-hour ride under a blazing sun, every man in the column spurred on by the mystery of what they had seen. When they finally reached the high plateau at the foot of the twin mounds, they halted, and a search party was formed. The colonel, his surgeon, and a handful of officers and men began to scour the area. A short time later, near a grove of large oaks, they found them. The massive, dead cougar and the broken body of Jack Hart lay near each other, just as they had fallen. The surgeon rushed to Jack's side, expecting the worst. He was alive, but just barely. He was horrifically torn by the cougar's claws and badly bruised from the fall, unconscious from shock and a massive loss of blood. The surgeon forced a flask of brandy between Jack's lips. A few minutes later, Jack's eyes slowly fluttered open. He looked around in a daze, his mind struggling to make sense of the faces staring down at him. Then, memory returned like a physical blow. He tried to push himself up, his voice a raw, desperate whisper as he pointed a trembling finger toward the spring. "Susie!" he rasped. "Near the spring! Hurry, for God's sake!" He tried to tell them about the massacre, about his relationship with the girl, but he was too weak, collapsing back if not for the hands that held him. Leaving a soldier to tend to Jack, the doctor and the colonel followed his frantic directions. They found her just as Jack had left her, sitting against the trunk of a large elm, weak and burning with fever. The carbine he had given her for protection lay across her lap. She was startled by their approach, but greeted them with a quiet, dignified nod, an act of formal civility that seemed utterly out of place in that hellish landscape. The officers were stunned, finding this island of grace and refinement in a sea of carnage. The colonel gently explained that Jack had sent them, that he was alive, and they were there to take her to safety. While the doctor examined her wound, they told her the story of Jack's bizarre fight and their even more bizarre rescue. Through it all, Susie remained composed, her face a mask of stoicism. Her grief for her family was a vast, silent ocean within her. But on the surface, she was so still that the officers mistook her profound self-control for a lack of feeling, a woman as unfeeling as a marble statue. It was a terrible misjudgment, a failure to understand the sheer strength required to not shatter into a million pieces. A rescue is not an ending. It is the beginning of the long, painful road back to the world of the living. The cavalry made a proper camp by the spring, and the surgeon immediately set to work with proper medical supplies. The nourishing broth and care he provided worked wonders for both patients, helping to stabilize Susie and giving Jack the strength to get back on his feet. Despite the agony from his wounds, Jack conferred with the colonel, pointing out the best and fastest road back to Fort Harker. He privately marveled at the strange chain of events. His desperate, rule-breaking decision to see Susie had led to a disaster that, through a series of miracles, had resulted in her salvation and the preservation of his own honor. A proper ambulance was fashioned for Susie, a comfortable litter made from fresh saplings and army blankets, carefully slung between two of the gentlest supply mules. To spare her the choking dust from the column, the colonel ordered this special transport to travel ahead of the main body of troops. Jack, though every movement was a fresh wave of pain, refused to be carried. He insisted on riding Tatanka alongside her litter, guiding the way back to the fort. Before they left the cursed place, the colonel had his men perform one last duty. They gave the members of the Raum family a temporary burial, placing heavy stones over their graves to protect them from the prairie wolves. It was a grim, somber task, but a necessary one. The column arrived at Fort Harker just as the sun was setting. Susie was taken into the care of the women at the post, and Jack was delivered to the fort surgeon for proper treatment. True to his tough nature, Jack healed quickly. Within a week, he was walking and ready for duty. Susie's recovery, however, was a different story. Her physical wound began to mend, but her spirit was broken. The terrible sorrow in her soul, a deep internal wound from the trauma she had endured, caused her to decline. A constant, low-grade fever burned through her, a physical manifestation of her grief and the gnawing fear that her dream of a life with Jack had been destroyed forever. Time is the only surgeon for such wounds, and it works slowly. Weeks crawled by. The golden days of October arrived, and with them came the start of General Sheridan's famous winter campaign against the Allied tribes. It was a war that would officially last 163 days and see General Custer's celebrated victory at the Battle of the Washita. While the Army was waging war across Kansas and Oklahoma, Susie was fighting her own quiet battle in her sickbed. A wedding was out of the question. The war had to be won first. It wasn't until the following spring, in May of 1869, that the long winter finally ended for them both. On a beautiful Sunday morning, in the Fort Harker Hospital Chapel, which had been decorated with wild roses and yucca blossoms, Jack Hart and Susie Raum were finally married. It was a remarkable ceremony, attended by a who's who of the American West. Generals Sheridan, Custer, and Sully were there with their wives, as were legendary scouts like Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok, all gathered to honor the couple who had survived the absolute worst the frontier could throw at them. Nearly a quarter of a century passed. The world moved on. The great generals who had attended the wedding were all dead. The forts were falling into ruin, and the brutal Indian wars had faded into memory. In the place of that violent world, a new one had been built. Jack Hart became a prosperous and respected rancher, his vast herds of cattle grazing peacefully on the same plains where he had once fought for his life. In the evenings, one could see him and Susie, now a stately and graceful woman, sitting on the porch of their fine home. As their own children played under the trees, they would sometimes speak of those terrible hours on the Elkhorn, retelling the story not as a ghost to be feared, but as a defining chapter in their lives, a picture on the wall of memory that time, war, and sorrow could never erase. The Cheyenne delivered a brutal massacre designed to be an ending. Instead, a stubborn scout, a ghostly battle in the sky, and a love that refused to die made an impossible rescue a reality. It's a stark reminder that history's wildest chapters aren't planned, they're forged in chaos and chance. For more unbelievable truths from the frontier, subscribe now.